Hello, everyone. On behalf of the American Red Cross and our International Humanitarian Law Program, I want to welcome each and every one of you to Boot Camp. Just kidding. There's a webinar where we're going to tackle one of my personal favorite TV miniseries of all time, Band of Brothers. And today we're going to explore through the lens of that program the lessons that we can learn about the law of armed conflict. My name is Thomas Harper, and I'm the Senior Counsel in International Humanitarian Law here at American Red Cross National Headquarters. It's my pleasure to be with you today. However, I'm not going to be Thomas today. Today, I will be your company commander. I will be Captain Sobel, who is beloved, no doubt, by everyone on this call, everyone familiar with the series Band of Brothers, and certainly every member of Easy Company. And I want to welcome you with a great spaghetti lunch. It is hearty, so go ahead and eat up. Here in the Army, if you're not familiar, we like to call this Army noodles with ketchup. So it's just a slight take, Uncle Sam's take on this classic dish. So go ahead and eat up. That's a great hearty, heavy meal. You need to carbo load to get this learning in. And oh, by the way, go ahead after you've had that meal, and we're going to run Currahee 3 miles up, 3 miles down. No one's going to help you along the way, and you'll be running it in boots as well. So you're welcome for that. And as an added bonus, all of your weekend passes are hereby revoked. So enjoy this mandatory class and make no plans for the weekend because you'll be cleaning latrines. Now, we're going to get started with a little sort of recap of where Band of Brothers took us. So for those of you who may be new to the series, maybe haven't watched it, or it's been a while, the series is over 20 years old now at this point, which is crazy. We follow the exploits of Easy Company, which is a parachute infantry regiment out of the 101st Airborne Division during World War II. Now, the series starts with their training in Georgia under Captain Sobel and getting ready to be paratroopers. But we follow them throughout World War II. We start their journey in terms of their combat operations with none other than D-Day, Operation Overlord, and the pivotal role that Easy Company played during that portion of the invasion. So we follow them from Normandy, France, to Holland during Operation Market Garden just a few months later in September. We go on to see Easy Company in action in Bastogne in the Ardennes in December into January of 1945. And then we follow their pathway as a unit all the way to the capture of Hitler's Eagle's Nest in 1945 as the war comes to a close. Before we can examine specific scenes and really unpack lessons in the law of armed conflict, we need to get a good snapshot of where IHL, International Humanitarian Law, was during 1944 when Easy Company went into action. If you're unfamiliar, international humanitarian law is synonymous with the law of war. It's synonymous with the law of armed conflict. What we're talking about are the rules, the laws that govern warfare, that dictate how conflicts are fought, the means and methods of those. And IHL as a body of law has evolved over the years. And so in 1944, I think as we sit here today, many of us are familiar with the Geneva Conventions. It's the 75th anniversary of those conventions. And if you're decent at math, we're talking GC 1 through 4, the sort of most famous, probably most famous elements of IHL, at least in the modern day. Those didn't come about until post-war. So the Geneva Conventions that so many of us are at least vaguely familiar with are actually products of post-war treaties. These came about in 1949 as the world came together. And what that didn't mean was that the world was without rules of war in 1944. So throughout the entirety of World War II and the entirety of Easy Company's action, there was a body of IHL that looked a little bit different than it does today, but it still had some important pillars. You did have Geneva Conventions that predated GCs 1 through 4 in 1949. You had the famous First Geneva Convention that was on the treatment of battlefield casualties. Here at the American Red Cross, this was getting the United States to sign on to that convention was one of Clara Barton's first objectives after she founded the American Red Cross in the late 1800s. You also had another convention on wounded armies in the field, and then a 1929 convention on POWs that followed World War I. Now, the GCs aren't the end-all be-all of international humanitarian law, because elsewhere you had another really important set of treaties, which are the Hague Conventions. So you can also refer to that as Hague Law, Geneva Law, but another important treaty or set of treaties, these were from 1899, 1907, still in force during World War II. Their provisions were still good law at the time. They remain, for the most part, good law today. You also had this element of sort of military practice. So another sort of, this fits in the sphere of what we call customary law. So the business of how militaries, how states conduct themselves during warfare. Now, a really common element of this are military manuals. Just about every military on the globe has sort of their rules, their procedures that they follow. The United States Army in 1944 was no different. You're looking at Field Manual FM 27-10. That's an FM that still exists today, but this was then the War Department, today the Department of Defense. This was their manual on the rules of land warfare. That existed. The copy that you're looking at today was the copy that was around circa 1944. So you had a set of state practices, military practices that had also evolved alongside and sort of in parallel to that treaty law as well. So now that we've got that sort of frame of reference, it's hi-ho silver. We're ready to dive right into the series. And we're going to start where it all started for Easy Company in Normandy. And we're going to talk about airborne operations and the law. So to bring us back to that framing historical piece, we're in the middle of Operation Overlord, otherwise known as D-Day. This is the beginning of June 1944, the invasion of Europe. So Fortress Europe is controlled by Nazi Germany, and this is the Allied effort, massive effort to break in and ultimately push to end the war. We're going to focus in on the 101st component of that invasion because their role was really specific. It was to jump behind enemy lines, to drop their paratroopers behind enemy lines and capture key targets as or just in advance of the Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy. And this was a massive operation. You had over 13,000 paratroopers involved, not just from the 101st, but from the 82nd and other elements as well. You had 5,700 air crew that were involved in ferrying those paratroopers into battle. And you had more than 800 of these C-47s that were tasked with carrying those paratroopers into battle. So an absolutely huge operation. And it begs the question, can those paratroopers be targeted by German forces? Or is there some rule that says that you need to wait until they're on the ground? And so let's take a look at what IHL says about airborne operations specifically. Now, you're going to scratch your head like Captain Sobel searching for his location on a map to find a mention of paratroopers or airborne operations in IHL as it existed in 1944, because there was none. Airborne as a concept, paratroopers as a concept, so parachute-borne infantry, brand new concept for World War II. They had never been used in sort of this size, this scale before. And so IHL, the sort of treaties and practices had nothing to say about paratroopers because it was brand new to the world. So that's not looking good for these troopers, right? No rules is not a good thing, except that the idea of folks coming down to the battlefield in parachutes wasn't anything new. Parachutes had been around for quite a while. Parachutes had been used in a military context since World War I. The world wasn't new to this, and there are actually rules that talk about folks that are descending to the battlefield by parachute. And so let's look back at the Hague Conventions, and not the ones that I highlighted earlier from 1899 and 1907. There's actually a bit of IHL that specifically targets the aerial warfare. So Hague Rules for Aerial Warfare came about in 1923. Air warfare came about in World War I. It's sort of finds its footing for the first time not too long. It's a little ironic that man discovers flight and then man immediately uses flight in warfare, but that's another discussion. But 1923, you had these rules that were set forth. And what those rules say is that when you have an occupant that's escaping an aircraft by parachute, they can't be attacked. Flat out rule. Now, let's take a comparison here, and I want to acknowledge that those rules of air warfare weren't universally accepted. So a treaty is about as good as those who sign on and agree to abide by it. I mean, they're compacts between nations, and there are very few treaties in the world in which all countries are party to it. The Hague Rules for Air Warfare are a good example of the shortcomings in treaty law, because these weren't universally accepted. They weren't universally agreed to by nations across the world. But let's look at two individuals that are emblematic of the operations here. On one hand, you have Captain Winters, the trustee at that time, platoon leader, but eventually would become company commander and eventually battalion commander. He's jumping into Normandy with Easy Company. You have another example, Lieutenant Daniels. Now, Daniels is a real life figure. I pulled him not because he was involved in D-Day, because he wasn't, but he's part of this new series that comes out tomorrow called Masters of the Sky, which was produced. It's a World War II series produced by the same folks that did Band of Brothers. He's a Tuskegee Airman. Is there a distinction between somebody like Lieutenant Daniels, a fighter pilot, and say Captain Winters and Easy Company? Well, let's take up Lieutenant Daniels first. So his job is to fly a fighter craft. And when we look at the rule against his role, that first phrase is really important there. It's talking about aircrafts that are disabled. So certainly World War I, that was the sort of entryway for these rules of air warfare. It proved that there were gaps in the existing law of war, because air warfare was brand new. And what the world saw there was that planes get shot down, planes get damaged, and parachutes were a really handy way for pilots or air crew to survive. And so the rule specifically talks about disabled aircraft and occupants escaping by parachute and prevents them from being attacked. Here's a good example. We want to protect that person because the idea here is that that pilot who's bailing out is fairly helpless. They've barely escaped a damaged aircraft, potentially one that's exploding, as they get out of it, and they're very, very vulnerable. And so the legal idea was to provide them with a sort of bubble of protection until they could get to the earth. So it makes sense that that rule exists. That is sort of a problem when it comes to Captain Winters and the paratroopers of Easy Company, because that concept doesn't neatly fit the role that paratroopers play. That's because paratroopers aren't there to engage in air-to-air combat. It's not like Captain Winters and Easy Company are sitting there firing their M1 Garands out the door of the C-47 to try to down aircraft. They are infantrymen whose job it is to be dropped behind enemy lines and conduct ground operations just like any other infantry unit. The mobility is the key aspect. The uniqueness of their role is that they can be ferried in and dropped in almost any place, and as long as their aircraft can get beyond the range of any aircraft, artillery, and whatnot, they can be inserted and be an effective combat force. But these are not helpless entities sort of parachuting after escaping an aircraft. These are soldiers who are specifically being inserted to conduct combat operations. And they don't really neatly fit that rule. So there is a pretty major legal distinction here, and it's borne out in more modern IHL as IHL developed post World War II. And certainly it was the case as airborne operations sort of got their footing in World War II. And that was that those pilots, air crew that were still, they were still entitled to protections while parachuting. You couldn't intentionally target them. There was a strong element of chivalry. So this idea of sort of respectful conduct on the battlefield that existed with regard to air crew and pilots. It was looked down upon even without the rules of Hague or other elements of IHL to engage or try to kill parachuting pilots or air crew. So they retain that protection. Paratroopers, so parachute-borne troops, are specifically not protected while they're parachuting. Now, I realize that many might point out who are familiar with the show that, in fact, Captain Winter's chalk or his stick on their C-47 specifically, as we see in the show, they were hit. So the co-pilot gets hit. The aircraft is hit in the cockpit. In a panic, the pilot turns on the green light and causes them to jump. So you could argue that C-47 specifically was damaged and maybe they fit. It doesn't change the nature of those paratroopers. Just because they were escaping that damaged aircraft doesn't suddenly transform them into the same sort of entity in the law's eyes as a fighter pilot or an air crewman. So before we move on to the next part, I just want to highlight an issue here, and I want to ask the group here, what is this that Captain Sobel is holding? And many of you may say, well, it's a can of peaches, Thomas, obviously. Well, that's wrong. Because it's actually United States Army property that I've found in one of your footlockers, and I want you to know that I will not tolerate petty larceny on this webinar. So tighten it up and just be careful. Know that I'm watching you as we move forward. So let's move on to our next portion, which is going to be one that is a central theme that runs throughout the entirety of the mini-series. And that's the sort of infamous Lieutenant Spears and his run-in with German prisoners. So to recap, we're early in the invasion of Normandy. The paratroopers have gained somewhat of a foothold. You see Private Malarkey here, slang for a word that I won't repeat here, even though it's a quote from the show. Malarkey runs into, or they walk past these German soldiers, and he starts talking to one who's clearly American, realizes that they're from the same town in Oregon. As Malarkey leaves, he passes Lieutenant Spears, who's coming toward this small contingent of German prisoners. We see Lieutenant Spears hand out some cigarettes alongside a US GI or two. And then as Malarkey is still walking away to rejoin Easy, he turns around at the sound of gunfire from back where the group is. And the sort of story that he brings back is that Lieutenant Spears killed all of the POWs alongside the one or two GIs that he was with. And this sort of legend, if you will, I use that in air quotes, like legend or infamy, it follows Spears throughout the entirety of the war. It's this sort of thing that no one can really confirm. They don't have an eyewitness. Malarkey didn't specifically necessarily see it. He heard it, pretty sure what happened, but it follows Spears throughout the entire war. And it begs the question, what rules are there, or how, what entitlements are there for prisoners captured during armed conflict for treatment? Now, recall that GCs 1 through 4 didn't exist yet. They weren't around until 1949, and that includes, uh, the Third Geneva Convention, which specifically lays out a robust set of protections for prisoners of war. And GC3 came about because of so many of the shortcomings, the mistreatment of prisoners of war that occurred throughout World War II. It was agreed upon and recognized that a new convention needed to be laid down to really increase the protections for POWs. But that doesn't exist right now in Normandy in 1944. Instead, what you have is the central tenet of treaty law is the 1929 Geneva Convention on POWs. So the law isn't a complete vacuum here. It's not as if there are no rules whatsoever. You do have this entire convention dedicated to POWs. And what it says right out of the gate in Article 2, as you see there, is that prisoners of war have to be treated humanely at all times. They've got to be protected, particularly against acts of violence. The drafters of Article 2 of the 1929 GC recognized, including from direct experience in World War I, that POWs were particularly vulnerable to violence, either killing along the lines of what we saw in this episode, which we'll get into the justification there in a second, or reprisals. So the act of killing or injuring, mistreating a POW as retribution for some wrong that was perceived or actually inflicted on the party inflicting the violence. So right out of the gate, it lays that down. And it's sort of like inescapable that execution of a POW directly contravenes that language. We're talking about not just like specific instances of violence that don't include death, but very obviously execution is included within the ambit of Article 2. So you're talking about a foundational component of GC 1929 that's invoked here. But there's an interesting wrinkle here, and it's one that you can find. Lieutenant Spears actually, or Captain Spears, or I guess he ended up as a lieutenant colonel post-war, but he has his own website. He's deceased now, but it talks about the fact that General Maxwell Taylor, who's shown here on the right, who is the commander, the division commander of the 101st Airborne, told 101st Airborne paratroopers just on the eve of D-Day that they were not to take any prisoners. He didn't explicitly say to kill them or treat them in any particular way, but he said that because of the nature of D-Day, because of their objectives and the importance of this military operation and the challenges of dealing with POWs once they're captured, that wouldn't be feasible, and that units should deal with prisoners in whatever way they saw fit. So that was really controversial. That's a controversial statement. That, again, that's not reduced to writing. This is sort of folks that allegedly heard General Taylor give this instruction have relayed this, and certainly Colonel Spears relates this on his website, or at least those that set that up for him. So we go back and here's the language that we're talking about, and we're still unchanged from Article 2. Even though a general has said it, that doesn't mean that just because you have rank on your shoulders, you can suddenly give an order to violate IHL. But let's roll back and look at Article 1, the very sort of entry point for GC 29. And it's got this interesting language here that you see. It talks about derogations. The convention shall apply except in where there are certain derogations because of conditions of capture. Derogations is one of these sort of weird legalese words. What it means in essence is sort of the pausing or the setting aside of a law for some particular reason. So think about something like martial law, this idea of sort of military control of an area due to, say, emergency conditions. And that's an easy environment to see what derogations are in action. When martial law is in effect, certain rights are curtailed. Maybe your ability to go out and do whatever you feel like, go run to the store, or run to get food. Maybe you have to abide by a curfew. Maybe you're not able to say everything that you would ordinarily be able to with free speech because of a derogation. So the convention here recognizes that there are certain circumstances where some of these rights that are listed, or some of these protections listed in the convention, can be set aside or can be sort of held up. And lay that language against the backdrop of Operation Overlord. You're talking about one of the absolute cruxes of the Allied war effort, this all-in effort to break into Europe and push to end the war, the sort of operation that was make or break for the entire war effort. And you're talking about not just the Allied force in general, but an airborne force that has a set of finite critical objectives that are tied to the success of thousands of soldiers who are landing on beaches up and down Normandy. And speed of action is critical for them. Secrecy is critical for them as they operate and try to accomplish their objectives. I think there's no better example of sort of military secrecy in action, operational security in action, than D-Day. The element of surprise to catch German forces off guard was one of the key elements of success there. And so you can understand, at least on a level, the sort of circumstances that might trigger Article 1, a derogation. Well, hey, we've got secrecy that's important. We've got this massive, important war effort here with this mission. So what better argument for a derogation of rights? But let's go back to the language, and that's not all it says in Article 1, because there's an additional clause there that says derogations can't infringe on fundamental principles of the convention. And so that's the idea that you can't just set aside everything. What good is the convention if you can just use a trapdoor to get out of all of the legal protections that are provided in it? And so while it doesn't define specifically in Article 1 a laundry list of fundamental principles, the idea here is to protect that core of the convention. And I would argue that Article 2 and that protection of humane treatment is the most fundamental principle of GC 1929. It certainly is a fundamental principle contained in 1929's successor in the Third Geneva Convention protecting POWs. So it's arguable that you can't derogate that humane treatment, that protection against violence. And that creates an interesting, it lays bare sort of one of these central moral fulcrum points in the war. I think the series does a fantastic job of exploring this, not just through the lens of Lieutenant Spears here, but across the series, where you have some very valid objective arguments about the Allied war effort, etc. But on the other side, you have the interest of humanity, the interest of those who are out of the fight as captured prisoners, etc. And I'm not here to balance those scales for you, but it is a credit to the series for actually tackling that sort of issue. And I do want to say that there is an interview with Colonel Winters, or Major Winters, that's out there post-war, and he does confirm that he spoke with Lieutenant Colonel Winters after. Good gracious, I'm getting all the names mixed up. With Lieutenant Colonel Spears after the war. So this is as the book is preparing to publish, and there's a concern that publishing this story about Spears is pretty salacious. It's the kind of thing that you might get sued for libel if you're printing a lie, recklessly sort of printing a lie about somebody. And so Winters calls him up, and they're still good friends, and he asks him directly, and Spears confirms that it happened, that he did in fact shoot the prisoners. And his approach, or they don't get into like a moral back and forth about it, but Spears' sort of stance on it aligns with those sort of framing devices that I was talking about, the nature of the mission, the order that was given, the whole backdrop of the mission. And so there's still that sort of unresolved moral component to this, but I do want to put that sort of end cap on that story. Winters himself in that interview notes that the idea of executing prisoners went against all of the laws of war that were in force at the time, and their practice, generally their understanding of what was right and wrong in the context of armed conflict. And you see this sort of play out in different ways throughout the series. One of the most poignant ones is in the episode Crossroads, where they've just captured a number of German prisoners, and Private Liebgott here is tasked with taking 11 German POWs back to regiment. He's clearly upset. He's been injured. Winters recognizes this sort of state that he's in, and he ejects all the rounds from Liebgott's Garand there, and he puts that one round back in the chamber, and he says, "You've got one round. If you drop a prisoner, you know the rest are going to bum rush you." And then he hands the rifle back and leaves it to Liebgott to escort the prisoners back. So you do see this sort of revisited in different capacities throughout the war, as depicted in the series. Before we move on to the next, I want to give a special award to Captain Sobel in recognition of the magnificent jacket that he wears early in the series during their training in England. I can think of no better collar to a jacket than the one that he wore with pride there in England. I quite frankly wish I had a jacket right now like that in January here in Pennsylvania. I'd be a lot happier. But congrats, Captain Sobel. We're all proud of you. So let's move on to our last topic here. And it's going to deal with one of my absolute favorite episodes in the entire series, Crossroads. And we're going to talk about combatants and IHL. So the backdrop to Crossroads is that at this point in time, we're post Operation Market Garden, so the airborne operation into Holland, present-day Netherlands. And Easy Company has been tasked alongside other elements of the 101st to defend this island. It's separated by these dikes and rivers and whatnot, and they've got responsibility over the western part of the island in October 1944. Overnight, some of their elements are engaged by Germans. It was sort of a surprise that there were Germans. They patrol out. Winters takes a part of the platoon out and encounters a German machine gun nest. Morning hits, and Winters leads this assault, and it's a great scene. Winters says, "Hey, everybody else, go on the red smoke," and he drops his smoke grenade, goes charging off into battle. The smoke grenade does not ignite for a few seconds, and everybody waits. So Winters is way out ahead of the group. He crests this berm and immediately is faced with just dozens of German soldiers, starts opening fire. But as he crests the hill, there's this moment where he's faced with a single German soldier. And it catches him by surprise. He kills the German, and that specific portion of the assault haunts Winters as he's recounting this operation. The episode is seen through the eyes of Winters as he's writing an after-action report, a report of the battle. And he's flashing back to this single portion of the incident, shooting that German soldier again and again, even while he's back on a small bit of R&R in France. And they're figure that's faded out there in the background is a young Frenchman. He doesn't know Winters. Winters doesn't know him. But Winters actually sort of imprints and sees this German soldier as this French man. And so it really bothers him. And so I want to talk about engaging that German soldier and what IHL has to say about it, because there's a little more to it that it helps explain the sort of moral conundrum that Winters was facing there. And we start with one of the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, and that's distinction. We're talking about a core idea that has existed and been a legal obligation throughout all of IHL, certainly was in place in World War II. And the rule there is that parties to a conflict have to distinguish between civilians and combatants. The idea is we want to shoot, attack combatants, and we want to protect those that are not in the fight, specifically civilians. And distinction also applies to objects as well. We use that term combatant, but what makes a combatant? It seems sort of plain on its face, but IHL actually has a lot to say about who is and who isn't a combatant. And IHL lays out some criteria for who's a combatant beyond the just membership in the armed forces of a party to a conflict. You have factors like being commanded by a person responsible for subordinates, wearing a fixed distinctive emblem that's recognizable, carrying arms openly, and then following the rules of war. So you see that sort of embodied in the picture of Winters there. He's got the American uniform on. He's wearing on his left sleeve there the distinctive emblem of the 101st Airborne. He is quite literally a commander responsible for his subordinates. He's got his arms carried openly, and he certainly fights within the laws and customs of war. So classic case of a combatant. And this isn't a close call as far as the surface level. So that German soldier that he confronts is certainly a combatant. That alone is not what haunts Winters. He's not bothered by the fact that it's a German soldier that he shoots sort of face to face like that. He's haunted because it's a teenager. He's haunted because it's a young German soldier. There's his face there. That's what Winters keeps coming back and reflecting on. That's the face that he can't get out of his mind. And so it begs the question, was this German too young to be targeted? Yes, he's wearing a uniform. Yes, he's a member of the German armed forces, et cetera, et cetera. But is his age, or should his age have stopped Winters from shooting him? Well, IHL does grapple with children and understand that at this point in history, you didn't have the Geneva Convention that specifically deals with civilians. You didn't have the provisions of some of the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which have really amplified the protections for children. But nevertheless, it's recognized even during this time through custom, et cetera, that children are especially vulnerable during armed conflict. And when we talk about children, IHL, says that a child is just defined as somebody who's under 18 years old. So clearly a teenager like this this German soldier here would be considered a child under IHL. And at this point in the war, and certainly as you got later into World War II and Germany became more and more desperate, you had the Nazis increasingly relying on younger and younger citizens to serve as soldiers. And so this is sort of a case in point with this young man here. And generally speaking, children are protected as civilians. So German sort of no matter what your age, under the age of 18, you're considered a civilian. Now, there are limitations to that. And that protection exists up until you take direct part in hostilities. IHL recognizes it's not blind to the fact that while it's sort of morally reprehensible, children do directly participate in hostilities. And so IHL recognizes that it would be sort of an ineffectual body of law if it tried to say that under no circumstances can a child be targeted. Because that just ignores reality. And so there's that exception that's built in. You've got to take direct part in hostilities. And that's exactly what's happening here. So it's an unfortunate and just morally very difficult situation that Winters himself grapples with. And I don't know that he sort of comes to closure with that situation. But very clearly, that young soldier not just was a member of the SS, so one of the Nazis' most infamous units, but he's acting as a sentry there. And as Winters crests that hill, there are dozens upon dozens, at least a couple companies worth of SS there, who are using that ferry crossing that's just out of sight to try to push back American forces. So very clearly here, even though that teenager, and we don't know his age, we're just going to assume based on context that he's under 18. Even though he is a child by definition, he's taking direct part in hostilities, and Winters had legal justification to engage and, in this instance, kill him. So I want to thank you for coming today. And before we transition into questions, I want to put a plug in for our program. If you haven't visited redcross.org and our IHL page, I invite you to do so. The web address is down there at the bottom. You can also use that QR code, scan it with your phone camera. It'll take you right there. It's a repository of upcoming events, volunteer opportunities. You can learn more about IHL. We have a ton of resources there stacked within that site, and you can learn more about our program. So I'd invite you to go to redcross.org/IHL. You can also join our email mailing list. We put out a monthly email with reminders about upcoming events. You can use that QR code on the left to join that list. And then you can also explore our YouTube channel using the QR code on the right. That is a full library of all of our past content, ranging from academic lectures to more pop culture oriented lectures like this one. We have a ton of content on there that's really helpful, no matter what your expertise. So I want to stop there and invite my colleague Christian, who's our IHL legal advisor here at National Headquarters, to let me know if there are any questions. But thank you all for being here.
Hey, Thomas, thank you so much for the presentation. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or use the Q&A function. Right off the top, there's just one question. I think it's just for clarification, like what would you do in an operational setting? But the question is, if you were, or if you are a paratrooper dropped in, where would you take a POW? You don't have a rear, right? That's the question.
Yeah, and that's you're right in the middle of that conundrum. And so we do see that fairly quickly in that conflict, they do set up sort of hasty headquarters. As you get later in the series, you have sort of regimental headquarters, battalion headquarters, that sort of thing that are set up. I think there's a difference maybe that can be drawn between the moment in time where these POWs are captured and maybe later in the invasion. But here, Malarkey is heading up the road to a relatively quiet area. I mean, it's not like there aren't Germans all around there, but it's not as if there wasn't any ability to sort of secure those prisoners. And I think it's, it's arguable that it's tactically disadvantageous to dedicate some number of soldiers to taking prisoners and watching them. But IHL requires what it requires in the interest of humanity, and there's that sort of natural tension point, and commanders have to make those really tough decisions. IHL lays out that there really isn't a decision to be made here, but that's not to say I'm not sitting here, casting judgment on Spears or Maxwell or anyone who's involved. It's just that natural tension point. And understand that there's no IHL police that are out there. There's nobody that's going to come slap a pair of handcuffs, from some international body on Spears. Certainly, you could have had U.S. forces that take action against somebody like that, sort of a self-enforcing mechanism, which is what's most typical. But you don't have that. And what you're relying on is good training, good sense, and good decision making, in balancing those tough scales as best as possible. But as far as the law is concerned, there really is no excuse to include military necessity for executing prisoners. And you see, it's not depicted in Band of Brothers, but later on, during the Battle of the Bulge at Bastogne, there's a really infamous execution of about 81 Allied prisoners, U.S. soldiers, by German forces who were retreating. Victor's justice is a thing, and the German commander at his trial at Nuremberg tried to make that sort of argument. Hey, we're retreating. We had a military necessity. They're not an airborne unit, different circumstance, but they're having to pull back. And his argument was, well, we couldn't just let them go and rejoin the force. We had to do something. We had to kill them, and that was resoundingly rejected. There's another great scene that's worth analysis or worth thinking through just on your own in Saving Private Ryan, as Captain Miller, Tom Hanks' character, leads that squad, and they capture that German machine gun nest, and that single German soldier survives. And there's that incredible tension point between some of the squad members who want to kill the German, and Tom Hanks has to grapple with the moral decision. They end up blindfolding him and tell him to walk and turn himself into the next Allied patrol. That decision ultimately ends up causing that German to cycle back into service, and he ends up firing the shot that kills Captain Miller at the end of the movie. So there's no easy answer to it.
Great. So the next question is, there's a scene where it depicted an American soldier with a collection of watches on his arm. The person who asked, I guess for the sake of their question, presumes that they were taken from the bodies of German soldiers. Can you speak to what IHL at that time or currently says on this? So I guess presumably let's consider it being on a dead enemy combatant.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I almost presented something sort of along those lines. Private Hubler, there's this sort of ongoing storyline up until Bastogne where he's looking for a Luger. He wants a German pistol as a memento from the war, and eventually gets one off of a dead German in Bastogne. The idea of property is a sort of mixed question. So generally speaking, looting is not allowed. Mistreatment of corpses is not allowed. A lot of times you see that in the military context taken care of or addressed by direct command orders. So the commander sets forth an order that says, you're not to do X, Y, and Z, to include, thieving or taking property like that. I think it's pretty well established that wasn't, if there were those sort of orders in place in World War II, it wasn't widely followed. They weren't abided by, and that doesn't mean that it's not unlawful. Generally speaking, you're not supposed to do those things. Weapons are treated a little bit differently, seen through the eyes of, do you need to deny the enemy the ability to recover that weapon later on and use it for military purposes. A watch obviously is just personal property. It's no different than pulling their wallet out and stealing their cash or something like that. So that would be prohibited. But again, that falls into one of those where you've got a massive amount happening at the time, and it really falls on the leaders to set conditions so that rules like that are important for just dignity, the dignity of human beings, especially those that have fallen in battle, are respected.
Great. And then I guess there's another question, and you've touched on it briefly, but maybe you could just speak on what IHL says. So I'm going to read the question, and then I'll probably paraphrase it. So specifically about what you talked about with the young combatant. Operationally, could you have captured the young combatant instead of killing? And I guess I'll add on to that. So when does IHL send the limits? Like, so if someone's surrendering, I guess, when does someone become hors de combat or out of the fight for the purposes of IHL, and saying that they're no longer a direct lawful target?
That's a great question, and it's kind of something that I think you can make an argument that Winters struggles with, because what you don't see in that scene is that German holding a weapon. I don't know if he's got a pistol hidden or something like that, but he doesn't have a rifle in his hands. And again, I don't know if there's one at his feet or something like that. But there's this idea that, is he or is he not giving himself up, or, is it wrong to shoot him because he's not armed? The business of whether he's carrying a weapon or not is sort of irrelevant because you can engage him as an enemy. He could be going to the bathroom and he'd still have that sort of combatant status. As far as the law goes, you become hors de combat when it's I'll set aside folks that are injured, but when you fall into the hands of the enemy. So when you give yourself up, when you surrender, etc., the IHL doesn't have a laundry list. Certainly it didn't then of like, hey, these are all the conditions and specific scenarios in which one would be surrendering themselves. It relies on sort of common sense in the circumstances at the time. So think about like waving a white flag or putting your hands up, like very clear indicators, like common sense indicators that somebody's giving themselves up. Once that has happened, or once you capture somebody, so say he ran down the embankment and hit the German soldier, kicked his weapon away, and put his boot on him, and the German didn't surrender, but he's sort of given up at that point. Once that threshold is crossed and they've fallen into the hands and they are out of the fight, so he's not resisting or something like that, trying to get back to his weapon or get a knife or something, they're hors de combat, they're protected, so they're out of the fight. And that's a great phrase, a French phrase that we see as a key element of IHL. I don't know that Winters could have done that, quite frankly, because you've got to. He's in a sentry position. Winters has milliseconds to react and engage just the dozens of German soldiers there. He's aided because, like, in reality, they're if you look, the Germans are wearing trench coats, so they're like slow to react. They're surprised. But I don't reasonably think that he could have run down the hill, done what was needed to do to subdue that German soldier, or like try to get him to surrender without getting killed or seriously injured. And there's a difference in the time span in when it actually plays out. I mean, it's like a millisecond versus his recollection of it, where it seems like this eternity where the two are staring at each other before he fires his weapon. So it's a classic example of the case that a lot of IHL decisions are being made in the heat of the moment with limited information and some extreme pressures on you. But that's a great question.
Well, thank you, Thomas. I think that's all of our questions. So I think that's it for today.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. If you know someone who couldn't make it on this call today, we are doing an encore presentation of this live tonight at 8 p.m. So please let folks know. You can find the link to register on redcross.org/IHL. If you just want to hear this presentation again, you're also welcome back out. But thanks for making time for us. I hope you enjoy maybe a rewatch of Band of Brothers, and I hope many of you are able to enjoy the Masters of the Air series. Thanks.